They could take a 4,000-pound bomb all the way to Berlin and back in 4 hours. You could send a Mosquito crew up twice in the same night, and they did. With the advent of the Mosquito, Bennett saw a great opportunity here that he felt was being missed. They are not just nuisance raids carried out by 2 or 3 planes. They are junior blitzes and more.
Welcome to episode 2 of the second series of our Fighting High podcast. And for today's Insights episode, I'm delighted to be joined by prolific author, Sean Feast, the go-to man when it comes to all things Pathfinders. Here at Fighting High, we've just published the paperback version of Frank Dell's excellent Mosquito Down. Frank was a pilot with 692 Squadron, part of the Light Night Striking Force. And today, Sean is going to give us an insight into this remarkable all-Mosquito force within a force, shall we say. Hello, Sean.
Hello, Steve. How you doing?
Great, thank you. So let's dive straight in to the story of the Light Night Striking Force. What was it?
Okay. Well, in very, very simple terms, it was a small force of Mosquitoes that were part of A Group. And the intention was initially to provide support to main force raids by ways of diversions, that sort of thing. Then they were employed doing nuisance raids, which we'll have a little chat about. And then ultimately they grew to such a size that they became like a mini main force in their own right. So it was one of those things that it was Bennett's idea, Donald Bennett, who's the chief of the Pathfinders. It was his idea. Harris, obviously, typical Harris, didn't particularly warm to the idea. He was very skeptical, but as usual, he backed his commander on this one at least, and a good job he did.
So we are correct in calling them Pathfinders.
Yeah, absolutely. So this can be very confusing, and I understand why it's confusing for people. But 8 Group was Pathfinder Force, and the Light Night Striking Force was part of 8 Group. So QED, they are Pathfinders. Now, I know there will be people jumping up and down saying, but they didn't mark targets. They didn't do this. They didn't get the badge. They didn't what have you. That's sort of splitting hairs. They were part of the Pathfinder Force. They were A Group people. They were Pathfinders. And I think part of the confusion comes because there's a lot of people who don't actually understand what Pathfinders was all about. They don't understand the makeup of the group at all. Normally, it's the other way. Normally, people turn around and go, I didn't realize that there were Lancasters or Halifaxes or Stirlings in Pathfinder Force. And if they know that there were Mosquitoes, then they only think of them in terms of the oboe mosquitoes. So people don't tend to then understand about the LNSF at all.
It's quite a wordy title, isn't it? Light Night Striking Force.
Yeah, it doesn't trip off the tongue, does it? To be honest, I mean, it's one of the reasons Harris didn't like it is because it had the word light in it, and obviously
Right.
what it really meant by that was light aircraft because it was Mosquitoes. But he seemed to think that implied that there was no sort of weight behind the force. So yeah, it doesn't trip off the tongue, but that's what it is. I can't change history.
So what was the germination of this idea? How did this force come about?
Yeah, I mean, it came about because the conventional bombing force, the heavy bombers, they were quite limited in what they could do. They were typically large formations that we think about. We think about the Lancasters, the Halifaxes, Stirlings, etc. We think about them coming in large streams and what have you. And it's all quite unwieldy. And early doors as well, it was particularly inaccurate. That's why the Pathfinder Force was formed in the first place. And with the advent of the Mosquito, Bennett saw a great opportunity here that he felt was being missed, which was that the Mosquito gave a level of sort of agility and flexibility to the planning of what they could do by way of bombing. He hadn't been able to do that with the existing force, but this gave him something new. What he didn't have at that point was obviously the numbers. He didn't have a volume of mosquitoes. There were not many of them being built, and those that were being built were already being allocated. So he knew he was going to have to bide his time and be patient. But in his mind, he was thinking, well, I've got two Mosquito squadrons already. I've got 109 and then later 105. There was a little bit of a pause between the two, but they were marking squadrons. They had oboe, the blind bombing device. They were used to mark targets, and then the heavy bombers would come along and bomb accordingly. He was then given 139 a squadron, and he started to use this squadron as to do some diversionary raids to try and draw the German defences away, and he started doing these sort of nuisance raids just to try and annoy the Germans. Why not? And then he thought, well, if I had more of these, what could I actually do? I could probably turn this into its own fighting force. I could probably mount my own raids. So he thought, given that there was a very specific bomber directive, which was the destruction of enemy morale, how could he deploy his mosquitoes, a mosquito force, to actually address that very specific objective? So that's actually how the whole thing sort of came into his head, where he wanted to go, the sort of direction of travel, as we could call it. But at that precise moment, he didn't have the equipment in order to do it.
So Bennett's seeing this is an opportunity for his force, more mosquitoes coming through to the front line. And we're looking at they start operating, we're looking around that winter period of 43, 44, aren't we? So during the
Yes.
Battle of Berlin period.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So just to recap, we've got the two oboe marking squadrons of mosquitoes, 109, 109 and 105. Then he acquired 139, which was not a marking squadron. Now I know that some people might jump up and down and go, "Oh yes, but it did mark targets," and it did later on, but it was not oboe equipped. Okay, it was using H2S to do that, but it did become almost the de facto marker squadron for the light night striking force. Interestingly, but that's by the by. So Bennett spotted the opportunity for this. He started to deploy 139 in doing these little nuisance raids and little siren raids. But fast forward to February 1944. So we're slap bang in the middle of the Battle of Berlin, as you say. And Bennett, by this time, has added another squadron, 692 Squadron. So he's now got two squadrons of Mosquito bombers now. So on the 23rd of February, he organized an attacking force of 17 Mosquitoes to attack Dusseldorf. What they did there was the oboe mosquitoes marked the target in the traditional sense, and 692 actually bombed the target, sort of in the traditional sense. But the big thing here, the big significance here, was that one of the mosquitoes was actually carrying a 4,000-pound bomb. So this is the first time this has happened, and all of a sudden you're taking an aircraft that typically is carrying half that sort of load, and therefore by definition can only do half the amount of damage, and now you're giving it something really quite significant by way of a payload. Sure, it's a long way short of Lancaster and Halifax and the like, but this is still a significant. This is now turning something from being a nuisance into something that's actually causing real levels of destruction.
But the development of the light night striking force at this time, it's not linear in respect of its growth. There's some variability in it as
Yes.
well.
Yeah, yeah, hugely so. And again, this all comes down to the resource that he's got to hand, and obviously the various changing directives that are happening throughout the war, where they are changing their sort of strategic imperatives, as it were. So if you look at, say, by the end of 1943, beginning in 1944, he's still only got a couple of squadrons to play with. One of those was 627 Squadron, which, as we know, and it's for another podcast for another time, sort of got taken back by five groups. So he lost that. Having been handed it, he then subsequently lost it again. So really, it was only by the end of 44 and into 45 that he started having the real numbers that he wanted. So if we look, as I say, at the end of December 43, he's only got 4 squadrons to hand. By the spring of 45, he's actually got 9 Mosquito squadrons within Pathfinder Force, and 7 of those are part of Light Night Striking Force. And that's if you leave out 627, which was also doing pathfinding, but within 5 group. And that's also if you leave out 1409 Met Flight doing their Pampas trips as well. So, and I don't want to do those fellas down, but so I'm talking pure bomber squadrons. He's now got 7 light night strike force squadrons to hand, so he can bring to the party now 140, 150 mosquitoes to attack a target by the end of the war. That's the difference, and that's how things began to sort of change. And as you say, well, there was nothing linear about it.
And these squadrons, they're operating in the east of the country. So we're in Norfolk area, Cambridgeshire,
Yeah.
8 group. We're in 8 group
Yep.
territory
Yep.
for those.
Huntington,
Yeah.
Cambridge. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
So who are the guys who are flying these aircraft? The very best crews, would you say, that had been recruited? What kind of people were they?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm hugely biased, but yes, you got to remember that everyone in Bomber Command was a volunteer for a start, and then if you went on to Pathfinders, you had to volunteer for Pathfinders. So you've got people who are volunteering twice, which is which is quite extraordinary. The majority of the men are on their second tour because there was a minimum sort of criteria at the time. Bennett wanted people to have had at least 1,000 flying hours to get onto a Mosquito in the first place. That was his sort of that was his ambition. That's what he wanted to get to. So the people who are most likely to have that were the people who had already done a tour in main force. They may well have also been done a tour or be partway through a tour in heavy Pathfinder squadrons. So 7, 83, 156, 582, etc. And then he might take the best of, say, the instructor staff, because often they would have many hundreds, if not thousands, of flying hours. And do remember that he was also after his big thing was about navigation. He believed to a greater or lesser extent, sort of almost anyone could fly a plane, but you had to get it there and you had to get it back and you had to find the target in the first place. So that's where his main focus will be. So if you think of Frank Dell, for example, very good example, Frank actually didn't have that much by way of flying hours, but his navigator certainly did. His navigator had done a tour on Sterling's beforehand. You've got a good and capable pilot, but you're pairing him with a very experienced navigator, and that equals a good crew. But if you look at some of the commanding officers of these squadrons in the light night striking force, I mean, these are top ends people. These are people like Jeff Wemsley who'd done main force, heavy PFF. Then he was the officer commanding 139. He was 75 plus ops. Ivor Broom, probably one of the most famous airmen of the Second World War, who in the later stages commanded one of the Pathfinder squadrons. He was 100 plus ops. Cliff Alabaster, who went on to distinguish himself flying the Comet after the war in particular, he was 100 plus ops. And then you get people like Guy Lockhart. Now, I don't want this to become a 5 group rant because I'm sure there's going to be lots of 5 group fans out there. But when old Webster and Franklin wrote their book on the strategic air offensive against Germany, they cite the 3 top bomber pilots of the war as being Gibson, Cheshire, and Mickey Martin. Look, it's an invidious thing, but I do sit there thinking, hang about, what you're saying there's no place for people like Guy Lockhart, who flew Spitfires, his 74 squadron, then he flew Lysanders, dropping agents into France. Then he went on to Mosquitoes and then ended up actually being killed in action while commanding officer of 7 Squadron. It is, I do sit there thinking, oh, wow, that was a bold claim. But there we go. But lots of these people, I think the thing is, Steve, that many of these names, a couple of them might be familiar, but generally they're not well known in the same way that, generally speaking, people might know Bomber Command. They might, at a stretch, know Pathfinders, but they won't know the Light Night Striking Force within that, as you said at the sort of top of the show, almost a force within a force. And that's a shame because they really should, because they really did achieve some great things.
I'd love to sit in, Sean, on you versus 5 group
Yeah.
advocates. That
Yeah.
would be a fight worth watching, I think. I very much enjoy that. We could sell seats for that one.
I think we bring it on. Bring
Yeah.
it.
So we've got light night striking force. We've got an all mosquito force manned by some of the very best. So can you give us a little bit of insight into how the force's tactics and its deployment differed from the rest of Bomber Command?
Yeah, sure. I mean, very early doors, they are there to create a diversion. They are extra aeroplanes you can put in the sky to try and drag the German night fighters away, and spoof. So you're protecting main force by doing that. You're protecting pathfinders, obviously, by doing that as well. Then you've got slightly more numbers. You're increasing the numbers, so you're actually allocating those mosquitoes not just to cause a diversion and make it look like something's happening. They are actually making something happening. They're dropping bombs. They're making lots of noise. They're causing a little bit of destruction. One of the key benefits of mosquitoes is that they can be almost everywhere all the time. So from a nuisance raid perspective, they are absolutely fantastic. They can do these things. They were called siren raids for obvious reasons, because they were designed to keep the sirens going all over the place for as long as possible. And if you're doing that, then you are causing great anxiety to the local people. You're keeping them awake in very basic terms. You're disrupting industry and manufacturing. So that nuisance actually becomes something more than a nuisance. It actually becomes something quite productive by way of its destructiveness in terms of production, industry, and the like. And then we talked about the 4,000 pounders, and you've got mosquitoes then who can go because of the speed that they can fly and the height they can fly. They're virtually untouchable. I mean, clearly there were losses, and that's not to detract from any bravery and the like, but they were clearly less risky to the crews, which is really good news. Now it meant that they could take a 4,000 pound bomb all the way to Berlin and back in 4 hours. Well, you and I know that it takes a Lancaster sort of 7.5, 8 hours to get to Berlin and back, and longer if you lost an engine or what have you. But at the later stages of the war, you could send a Mosquito crew up to go to Berlin and back twice in the same night. And they did. They actually did that as well. So, although on the one hand, you could argue, oh, well, it's not the same weight of bombs, you can similarly argue, well, they went there twice. So, you got twice going on. It's a 2 man crew, not a 7 or 8 man crew. And we'll talk about B-17s in a second. You haven't got a sort of 10 man crew either. So they're much more efficient and productive for what they're actually what's actually being achieved.
And when it comes to servicing as well, you're not servicing 4 engines. You're servicing 2 engines per aircraft
Yeah,
to deliver in one night 8,000 pounds of bombs.
yeah,
You mentioned the B-17.
I did.
Dare we go there? I'm going to let
Yes,
you I'll sit back and let you go there,
yes. Let's
comparing the
let's
Mosquito to the B-17.
let's dare, because let's face it, I've mentioned the unmentionable with Gibson and Cheshire and Co. So why not go there and go the whole hog? I think the thing is a fully laden B-17, great aircraft though it was. Just shove that one in as a little caveat. Um, Fully laden, it could go to Berlin. It could only carry about 3.5, 4,000 pounds worth of bombs. So the exact equivalent. So it's an exact like for like by way of payload. Now I have seen it argued that, yes, but they could spread the bombs over lots of smaller bombs. Well, I think if you gave any American aircrew a chance of dropping just the one bomb and hightailing it out of there, I think they would have bitten your arm to do so. So I'm not sure I hold that argument that they could therefore drop them all over the place, with their northern bomb sight and pickled barrows. I'm not convinced about any of that. So it's mainly you have to look at things like the loss rate as well. I mean, these are really important. I was looking at some figures. I mean, I'm aware of a source that said something along the lines of out of 27,000 light night strike force sorties, there were only 108 mosquitoes lost. Okay. Now, in fact, if you go and look at the individual squadron losses within light night striking force, you'll see that they're losing on average. They lost on average around about 0.4%. of their force. Okay, now compare that to a heavy bomber squadron. So a Lancaster squadron, for example, and they're losing about 10 times that amount. They're losing 4%. Sometimes as much as 5.5%. So I think it's fairly obvious where one of the principal strengths of operating a Mosquito bomber lay. I think there's a wonderful story that I do want to just cite that is in Bennett's book, Pathfinders, about the significance of the £4,000. And there's a story about when Bennett was at his headquarters, and he's visited by an American journalist from the Herald Tribune, Mrs. Helen Rogers Reed, and they're standing there and they're watching the mosquitoes taking off into the night. And she asks Bennett, how many bombs can it carry? And Bennett replied that it was carrying a 4,000 pounder. And she didn't seem to be particularly impressed by this. So Bennett, never one, never one to miss the opportunity of embarrassing a guest, basically compared the performance of Mosquito to the B-17, which was being much hyped at that time. And he said to her, well, at present, with the routing which they use and with the larger load of ammunition necessary for daylight operations, they're carrying 3,500 pounds of bombs. And he added, in any case, they cannot carry a blockbuster as it's too big for their bomb bays. And Mrs. Reed apparently looked seriously at him and said, I only hope, she said, that the American public never realized those facts. It's a great,
Mm.
it's a great story.
Yes, yes. I, I will come to the defence of the B-17 a little bit. Its role is very different, of course, in that it's part of achieving air superiority, and as such, it's involved with attrition. It needs armament. So that has always been the compromise with the
I,
B-17.
I'd agree with all of that. All I would say is that Bennett had turned around at the end of the war and basically said if he could have had mosquitoes in the numbers that he'd had at the end of the war, if he could have had them earlier, he would have taken a decision to make his force all mosquitoes, and therefore saving thousands of lives in the process.
Yes. So the light night striking force, they're attacking the traditional targets, industrial centres, factories, or with transportation networks, marshalling yards, but they're also involved in some special operations as well.
Yeah, yeah, very, very definitely. Yes, it's important to stress that they are actually conducting meaningful operations in late 44 and into 45. These are meaningful ops. So it's not, we've gone beyond the nuisance, and they're still doing the nuisance raids, by the way. They're still making a nuisance of themselves, but they are also conducting meaningful operations. But they were earmarked for a couple of specials, as it were. I'm really mindful now. I'm going to go down another 5 group bash, which I really don't want to do. But hey, here we go. So one of the operations was on the Kiel Canal. This is May 44. This is just before the invasion of Europe. And the Kiel Canal is a critical route getting goods and supplies from the Baltic to the North Sea, and vice versa, without having to go all the way around the sort of Jutland head, as it were. So it's a vital supply route. So the RAF come up with this ingenious wheeze that they've been trying to mine the Kiel Canal forever and a day. It's one of their favorite targets. I think it was one of the first ever targets, actually, back in 39. But they decide that they really need to bomb a critical juncture within the canal that would cause the maximum disruption possible. So a small force of 13 bombers took part. The route was marked on the way by 139. So that's where we come into the 139 playing a role in making sure the aircraft got there. Because you've got to remember, you're trying to find a canal in the dark. You've got to navigate your way. You've got to find a particular part of the canal that you're also trying to mine. This is an incredibly difficult thing to do. But despite that, of the 13 crews taking part, 11 of them actually successfully dropped their mines. One aircraft was unfortunately lost, but they managed to cause significant disruption to traffic on the canal. And in fact, there's a wonderful contemporary newspaper report which translated says basically not even a rowboat was allowed to risk the passage of the canal, and that went on for about 8 to 10 weeks. So that this was really significant. Now Bennett held it up as being a shining example of just what the light night striking force could actually do. Now he slightly spoiled it actually, and spoiled it for himself, because he added, without the fuss and bother to which some others in bomber command were prone. Now that's a direct. He's just having a pop at Cochrane. He also, interestingly, in his biography, sort of says that none of those taking part received any medals and awards, and that's just abject nonsense, because a dozen or so of them did, at his own making. So he sort of let the side down a little bit there, but it shouldn't detract from a hell of a raid. And then the other really, really, really good one, right in the middle of the Ardennes offensive, so the Battle of the Bulge, as it's known. Germans were obviously using the railways, the networks, to try and get troops and material to the front line. And so another plan was, if we bombed the tunnels of the railways, if we could block the tunnels, then we could obviously stop the flow of rail traffic on those lines. So on the new year of 1945, three LNSF squadrons took part: 128, 571, and 692. And they literally had a series of targets throughout Germany at various points, and they effectively skip bombed the tunnels. So they got down to 100 feet, dropped the bombs so that they effectively bounced into the tunnels and along the track, and then exploded. And again, this was an operation conducted with tremendous success.
So these attacks on these railway tunnels, they're very, very, very low, and as you say, very successful.
Yeah.
One of the Mosquitoes dropping its bombs below 100 feet.
Hmm.
So we've taken the light night striking force through. We're now into 1945, and how would you assess the success and effectiveness of the LNSF?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think its success was actually probably out of all proportion to its size. I'm not even sure Bennett himself thought that it would be as successful as it turned out to be. We know it was successful in its siren raids. Goebbels frequently mentions how irritating those raids were. Goering himself comments on a wider level how irritated he was by the Mosquito itself. So it's another illustration of just what an incredible aircraft it was. But I think it's this evolution rather than a revolution. It's taking this fact that at the beginning they're operating, yeah, sure, it's penny packet stuff to cause a little bit of a nuisance and disruption. Then it's emerging and evolving into something more powerful. Then they're actually becoming effectively like a mini main force in its own right, conducting quite significant attacks on targets. So I think, as somebody said, sort of moved from being a nuisance to a menace. I really like that quote. There was a particular time in Bomber Command operations when the main force couldn't get out particularly often because of the weather and the like. But despite that, Mosquitoes were often able to operate when main force couldn't. So they were able to keep the sort of pot boiling, as it were. There's an incredible statistic, actually, that from February the 20th, 1945 onwards, Light Night Striking Force bombed Berlin. Get your head round this, okay? They bombed Berlin every night for 36 consecutive nights.
Hmm.
And the average number of Mosquitoes on each of those raids was 60 on every attack. When you allow those figures to sink in, I think that's when you get a real handle on just how effective they were. They were the force that also conducted the last operation of the war on the 2nd of May, 1945. And again, it's a brilliant illustration of how far the Light Night Striking Force had come when they attacked the airfields and naval dockyards in and around Kiel. And on that attack, there were 126 Mosquitoes attacking Kiel in two raids that were just 1 hour apart. And again, there's another contemporary newspaper article in talking about LNSF that said they are not just nuisance raids carried out by 2 or 3 planes, they are junior blitzes and more. And I think possibly the last line should really go to the summary of LNSF achievements, which was written up in the Bomber Command Review at the end of the war in 1945. And it said, and I quote, "The value of the Mosquito attacks as a supplement to the attacks by heavy aircraft is unquestioned, and their contribution to the success of the combined bomber offensive was both significant and praiseworthy."
Well, I think that's a fitting way to end this podcast. Thank you very much indeed, Sean, for being that champion of the Light Night Striking Force. It's worth mentioning 2 books with Light Night Striking Force connections that we've published at Fighting High. There's Frank Dell's superb biography, Mosquito Down, which is now available in paperback. And we've also had the privilege of publishing LNSF pilot George Dunn's book, Resolute. Details of both books on the Fighting High website. Thanks for listening to the Fighting High podcast. You can follow Fighting High on X using @FightingHigh. Visit fightinghigh.com for details about books, and follow the Fighting High publishing page on Facebook. If you have enjoyed this podcast, then please follow or subscribe and leave us a review.